We can't say that this increase happened because of the project. So in order to establish that, in order to say that that has been the case, the methodologists have come up with the idea of a counterfactual or a control group or a comparison group. They're slightly different, but let's say a control group. So you take a control group without the intervention. And without the intervention, at the end of the project, this is where the control group would have been. Not would have been, you actually measure. So we measure the relevant variables at the beginning of the intervention or just before the beginning of the intervention, and we also measure it at the end of the intervention. So now there is a difference between the two groups. Right. So what can we say is the impact then? What would you say the impact is? It would be that because the project people marked in brown received the intervention and their status changed like that. The people who did not receive the intervention, their status also changed. So therefore, that difference is taken as the impact. But there is a problem here. The problem is, at the beginning, before the intervention, the people who received the intervention and the control group should have been similar, in fact, identical in every respect. That is both observable and non-observable. Now, observable would be like, let's say, the levels of literacy, the amount of schooling, and let's say the education or income, etc. What are some of the unobservable things? The unobservable qualities would be, let's say, the ability of individuals to make use of the project, things of that nature. So, finding a proper counterfactual is one of the difficult things in doing an impact evaluation. You can't find people who are identical. Not can't find, but it's difficult. And at the same time, people don't live in isolation. They also receive some of the project benefits in some indirect ways. So this is one of the challenges of doing. This is why, because of this difficulty of finding a counterfactual, a control group that's identical or very, very closely resembling the project beneficiaries, the statistical technique of randomized control trials came in. So actually in the early 2000s, Donald Campbell, in his honor actually, a foundation was established. It was called Campbell Collaborative, C2. That institution and also later Poverty Action Lab, they advocated very strongly for randomized control trials. So what are randomized control trials? The project, the people are assigned to the project randomly, and they are not assigned to the project also randomly. So the argument is there is a statistical control between these two groups, and they should be identical. The differences are statistically ironed out. So there was some very big arguments, very hot debates. In, I think, late 1990s, there was a conference in Cairo where people were divided very strongly. One reason for this debate is that if you give the intervention to one group of people and on purpose don't give the intervention to another group of people, there's an ethical issue. So such issues, practical issues, lots of these, and the very statistical techniques, the flaws in it were there. And a very critical moment was when at a conference held in Cairo, I believe, randomized controlled trials were considered the gold standard in impact evaluation. So that is actually why organizations like NONI and 3IE came up, but let's talk about it in a minute. Certain other things can also happen when you do randomized controlled trials. For example, at the baseline, if the project beneficiaries are like that, this can be the trajectory. There is a midterm, there is an end of project, and there is also time after the project. Very often, impact evaluations or any follow-up does not take place after the project. Now, this is the way the project beneficiaries changed the outcome. Let's say if you are looking at the income increase, that is how it has changed. And then if you look at the counterfactual, they would have changed like that. Now, the counterfactual keeps increasing regularly. The project participants' outcome increased, then it had started on a downward path. So look at this, it's very interesting. At the beginning, ideally, they are similar. Halfway through, in the midterm, you see a big gap, and at the end, the gap has reduced, and subsequently, it actually reverses. So there are these issues to consider. And okay, let me skip this. I just wanted to say at every phase, there should be learning built into the process. I want to skip these slides. The United Nations Evaluation Group, a summary of what they have done, what they have proposed. The purpose of impact evaluation today is on accountability and lessons learning. And it's very much based on a cause and effect relationship. So all projects must be built on cause and effect relationships. And methodology, today there is no consensus that randomized controlled trials or any particular method is the gold standard. The method is determined by the evaluation questions, by the purpose, and the recommended approach is to take a method mix. Some quantitative methods for particular types of questions, qualitative methods for other types of questions, and these must complement each other. And there must be a theory of change. So these are some of the current proposals, recommendations. A theory of change, I think you're very familiar with it, so I wouldn't want to take time on that. But now this is a theory of change. Right at the beginning, right at the top is the impact. Impact is caused by certain outcomes in orange boxes, and they are caused by certain outputs, etc. But in real life, it is not that simple, it's complicated. So it's the task of the people who design programs and also people who evaluate to sort this out, simplify, and come up with a theory of change. And also today, it's very important that evaluations must not be done by an external evaluator or a team of evaluators, but joint impact evaluations of multi-agency interventions can deliver additional findings beyond evaluation of individual components. And it's also extremely important, as was very rightly and emphasized by previous speakers, inclusion. Marginalized, vulnerable people must be included in the evaluation process. Their participation is extremely important. And there should be fair power relations. It's not the donor, the funder, the program manager, but they can't exercise their power unduly because that would affect the evaluation findings. And mixed evaluation methods, not simply randomized controlled trials. And then all UN interventions have a mandate to address human rights and gender equality issues. And UN here actually means the collective of the government. So all government development programs have this mandate to examine the human rights and the gender equality issues. So I think with that we finish, and thank you very much for your patient hearing. Thank you.
I would now request Lakshmi ma'am to kindly hand over the token of appreciation. With great pleasure, I now invite Shri V.R. Kaundinya to address the gathering on agriculture and rural development. We welcome you, sir.
So I'm going to talk about agriculture and rural development, and basically I'm going to highlight certain challenges and maybe a few suggestions. Perhaps it can also act as some kind of an input for the afternoon session. I believe you have a session on agriculture and rural development. I'm not a social scientist, so I will not talk much about the social aspects of this, but I will certainly highlight some of the challenges we have on this in this sector. So agriculture is a production process, right? So many times we mistake agriculture as just a supply system for our food, but agriculture is actually a production process. There is an input and there is an output. So there are input-output ratios, and the farmer is, or in other words, I should say that agriculture is the largest private enterprise in the country. There is no other private enterprise which is as big as agriculture. And in a country which has followed a socialistic pattern for a long time, the farmer is the single most important and the largest entrepreneur in the country, right? So he actually battles with many things in the field every day, and his challenges are very different from what we can visualize even sitting in air-conditioned rooms. So I think it's a very different ball game when you get into the field. So I will talk a little bit about those things, but I think the most challenging part of agriculture is to strike a balance between various demands that are coming through increasing populations, climate change, food security. And when we say food security, I want to emphasize that it is not just about availability of the quantum of food, but the distribution, which is called accessibility, and the affordability of food. You may have a lot of food in the world, but are the people able to afford that food? I think that's a major part of this equation, and that's where actually agriculture has to produce food which is affordable for a large number of people. Agriculture doesn't mean just crop production. It includes, you all know that various dairy, poultry and various other things. This is an interesting one. I just want you to observe that in the country, 85% of the farmers are marginal farmers, and their average holding is 0.38 hectares. That means it is hardly 0.15 acres. It is less than 1 acre. And the small farmers are another 35 million hectares is with the small farmers. About 24 million farmers are there who hold such small holdings. So 85% of the farmers hold 44% of the land, and 15% of the farmers hold 56% of the land. So this is a distribution of land and the holding size which has an important impact on the agricultural strategies. We are adding 15 lakh new farmers every year. With the increasing population, the number of farmers is going up every year by 15 lakhs, and the holding size is getting coming down. As you can see that over a period of time, the change since 1995 has been very significant. The trend is that the population increase and the food demand is going up. Not only food demand is going up, but if you see really the different, you can see here that 55% of our population is dependent on agriculture, but agriculture contributes to only 15% of our GDP. So there is a dichotomy here which is actually leading to many issues that we face today in terms of the attention to agriculture. Farmers' profitability has been down, and 40% of the farmers want to quit agriculture as per the last NSS survey. And as I always say in such fora, there are two people who, if they quit their posts, we will be sunk. Those two people are the farmer and the soldier. You know, the Jawan and the Kisan, if they want to quit their posts, that means that is the most difficult period for the country. So we have to be very careful when the farmers reach such. This is a study by Indian Institute of Management which has brought out the changing consumption patterns in the country. Between 1970 and 2010, the consumption of cereals as a part of our overall food has come down by more than half. And what has gone up, you can see here that animal products have gone up by more than 50% in the rural areas. Edible oils have gone up, but you see vegetables and fruits has tripled in most of the areas. So the demand for vegetables and fruits is going up dramatically, while the demand for cereals is coming down. So the rice and the wheat, on which we have emphasized so much since our independence, are actually coming down in terms of their importance in our food. And this has a major impact on the way we have to do our agriculture. We have, on the other hand, a high level of food inflation, which we have seen in the last 10 years, which has actually led to serious problems for the previous government, that more than 50% of the food items have shown more than 50% inflation trend in the last 10 years. So this is mainly because of the difference between, as you all know, between demand and supply. So we are not able to cope up with the demand for vegetables and fruits and animal products. Meat consumption has gone up, and I don't know how many of you know that to produce 1 kilo of meat, you need 5 kilos of agricultural produce, whether it is food grain or fodder or whatever it is. So as meat demand is going up, the demand multiplier on agricultural produce is very, very high. So there is a study by ICRIER which shows how much the food demand is going up. It is actually doubling by 2020, and the major significant increase is coming in meat, fish and eggs, vegetables and fruits. So those are the ones which are having major impact. Farmers earn on the basis of the crops they grow, different levels of earnings they have, and you can see that they are getting maximum earning in chili, fruits and vegetables, partly because of the demand and supply gap. But if you come to wheat, lowest profitability, rice, third lowest profitability. So you can understand that in the country where we grow 42 million hectares of rice and 25 million hectares of wheat, totaling around 70 million hectares out of our total 150 million hectares, half the acreage goes to rice and wheat, where farmers make least money. And this is one of the reasons why the farmers don't have enough profits in their profession, and they want to leave the profession. The food habits are changing. I have already talked about it, I think. And another important thing is that pulses, we are not able to meet the demand. Our imports are going up. We started importing in 2004. Today we are importing 3 million tons of pulses. And if you project to 2030, we will need 15 million tons of pulses to be imported. There is no country in the world which can grow 15 million tons of pulses for us. We are the largest producer and consumer of pulses in the world, and there is no other country which can do this. See, edible oils. We are already importing, this is 2011 figure. It has already crossed 50% mark, imports of edible oils. And by 2030, it is expected to touch